Sonny's Blue article discussion. So, I know we all read the same story, but I'm going to dive a little deeper into the analysis of it through this presentation. So, to start out and to serve as a little memory refresher, the story is centered around the relationship of two brothers. One, a teacher in his hometown of Harlem, and the other, Sonny, a current drug addict on the verge of being released from prison. It features the struggle and challenges both of these characters have gone through in their life, which then highlights a further understanding of each other as brothers in the end. Isabel and Grace were not the main characters of the story, but they served significant parts and emphasized a theme in the story, which is the strength of family. Isabel is the narrator's wife, who seems to be the first person to accept Sonny back into the family. Grace is the narrator's daughter, who died in an unfortunate death, but that death is what prompted the narrator to get in touch with Sonny in prison. So the storyline kicks off when the eldest sibling, a teacher in Harlem, reads in the newspaper of his younger brother, Sonny's arrest for selling and using heroin. After processing this news, the narrator runs into one of Sonny's old friends, who begins talking to him about his brother and the drug addiction they both suffer from. This sparks a bunch of memories about the brothers' past and childhood. So, when the narrator's daughter, Grace, passes away, the narrator finally decides to get in touch with Sonny in prison. Sonny is invited to stay with his brother and his wife after being released. The reunion does not go smoothly at first, and things don't necessarily seem to fall into place. After all those years, things are very awkward between the two brothers, and there seems to be many unspoken words between the two. There seems to be absolutely no trust or confidence from the narrator's end, because he ends up searching Sonny's room for drugs in a few weeks after he was released. The brothers seem to begin to hash out their issues when Sonny returns inside the house, but the narrator still does not seem to understand Sonny's addiction and his passion for music. He cannot separate the two. Regardless, Sonny invites his brother to come watch him play music in a jazz bar. So his brother listens to him play the piano, where at first he was a little rusty, but he got to see his brother's love and passion for music. It was a moment of understanding between the brothers, and the narrator made another promise to watch over and be there for his brother, despite Sonny's drug addiction and past. These right here, these are the main themes that were discussed throughout Sonny's Blues: drug addiction, music, and family. Okay, so Sonny, being a heroin abuser, affected almost every single person in his life. It ruined relationships, specifically between his brother and him. Music was his passion, and is something that brings people of all races, shapes, and sizes together. Jazz music was an important part in Harlem in the 1950s. However, the narrator related Sonny's drug addiction with his profession of music, despite all the good things music brought about. Another main theme is family, okay? So many readers might think that the narrator turned his back on Sonny, and that is why he struggled so much throughout his life. But this story is a good representation of the strength of family and what family can do for that person, a person. Okay, so the article that I read and summarized was The Biblical Foundation of James Baldwin's Sonny's Blues by James Takash. The author argues that there are two main biblical texts that influence the story: the Cain and Abel story from the book of Genesis, and the parable of the prodigal son from Luke's Gospel. So, in the well-known biblical parable of the prodigal son in Luke's Gospel, chapter 15, it features the story of a father and his two sons. The younger son leaves home, and the oldest son remains with his father at home working. When the younger son is welcomed home with open arms, the eldest son becomes angry. This can easily be compared to the characters in Sonny's Blues. Sonny was the son who left home and didn't necessarily follow the path he was supposed to. Hence, you know why he got caught up in the drugs and ended in prison. While the narrator, the eldest son, followed everything he was supposed to and became the respectable teacher and family man. It is hard not to see and agree with the article in regards to the similarities between these characters. The author also argues that the prodigal son and Sonny's Blues are both tales of sin and redemption. You know, um, so this is seen in the book of Luke and also when Sonny comes home after prison. With Sonny's problem with heroin addiction, he has committed many sins in his past. However, when his brother invites him to return home and they begin to hash out their issues, both Sonny and his brother seem to be redeemed in themselves and in their relationship as siblings. This is a similarity that, I 100% agree with. To me, is a large part in both stories. Before Grace dies, she prompts the narrator to write to Sonny in the first place. However, the author of this article argues that her name Grace is highly symbolic of biblical foundation. While I agree that her name in itself is symbolic of God's grace, I do not necessarily see how it connects with the biblical foundation of the two stories the article mentioned. It never seemed to reference it with a specific moment in the Bible. So, this one, for me, I strongly agreed with. Being responsible for... Oh, sorry. In Genesis 4:9, right here, in Genesis 4:9, God asked Cain of his younger brothers, Abel's whereabouts, after he already killed him. And Cain replies, I know not, am I my brother's keeper? In comparison, the narrator in Sonny's Blues promised his mother that he would take care of Sonny. However, both the narrator and Cain failed in knowing their brother's whereabouts. Cain, when he replied to God, I know not, am my brother's keeper. And the narrator, when he didn't even know his brother had become arrested. This is another point the author made that I strongly agreed with. Being responsible for the younger brothers played major roles in both of these stories. So, if you have a strong background knowledge of the Bible, you will remember that the book of Genesis is often referenced as the fall. The author in this article argues that by James Baldwin frequently using the verb to fall in his short story, he is referencing a strong biblical foundation. This is a point that I didn't 100% agree with. To me, it seemed like quite a stretch, honestly. So the verb to fall can be placed in many different contexts. So I do not necessarily see the relationship between the two stories and how it has a strong correlation to a biblical foundation. It may be a more subtle approach. The article argues that the final scene in Sonny's Blues, where Sonny is at the piano and his brother sends him over a glass of milk and scotch, when he finally begins to understand Sonny's love for music as a profession and is able to separate the music and his addiction. It is compared to the cup of trembling in the book of Isaiah. God pledges to aid the people of Jerusalem regardless of their sins. Because of their sins, they had drank at the hand of the Lord the cup of his fury. This cup serves as a symbol of God's special protection. This can be compared to Sonny's cup, which symbolizes his brother's special protection. This is another point that I felt was a strong comparison the author made between the two stories. So, I thought this was one of the most interesting takes on the story of Sonny's Blues. The biblical influence was mentioned in our module, but was something we didn't discuss in our discussion boards. This article that I used and referenced throughout this presentation, this is the article that I used. I hope you all enjoyed, and this concludes my presentation.